How does communication influence the way we lead and are led? From presidential libraries to the evolving world of digital archives, our guest today will reveal how effective leaders convey their vision. We're excited to welcome Dr. Colleen Shogan, Director of the National Archives and Records Administration. Dr. Shogan exemplifies the ability to clearly articulate a vision, inspire a large team, and navigate the intricate challenges of digital transformation. Welcome to Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library. I'm Dr. Lindsay Travinsky, Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. In this podcast series, we talk with leaders from across the nation about their growth, challenges, and innovative approaches that made them the leaders that they are today. The first 6 conversations, which took place between August 2023 and March 2024, were led by our former Executive Director, Dr. Patrick Spero. In the spirit of George Washington's leadership, this series will feature the perspective of leaders from across industries and fields. As such, the thoughts expressed in this podcast are solely the views of our guests and do not reflect the opinions of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. In this episode, we'll explore how Dr. Shogan integrates strategic communication into her role, her commitment to a user-centered approach, and the impact of historical figures like George Washington on her leadership philosophy. As the leader of the National Archives and Records Administration, overseeing 15 presidential libraries and more than 13 billion records, Colleen will share the communication principles that help her navigate the complexities of managing both traditional and digital archives.
Even if you are setting high expectations or you're delivering a message that people initially aren't that excited to hear or aren't that wild about, the clearer and the more direct you are in those communications, the better off you will be.
And now our host, Dr. Patrick Spero, former Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon.
Well, Colleen, it's great to be here today. I'm so thrilled to have a conversation about the archives, their role in American society, but also what it means to be the leader of an institution like this. So I'd like to begin with something that sounds like a very simple question, and that is, if you were teaching a course, let's say it's an English course for people that are learning the language, and you had leadership as a word to explain to the class, how would you define it?
That's a great question, and I don't think I've ever heard it articulated in that way. But I think leadership is really motivation and persuasion. And that can mean motivating and persuading a small group of individuals, or like the situation that I'm in right now as the head of the National Archives. We have 2,600 people that work at the National Archives. But it's about articulating a vision and motivating or persuading others about that vision.
That's great. And I want to ask you about being the National Archivist and what leadership means for someone in your position. Do you think that the challenges you face are universal, or are there things that are unique to being an archivist?
I think the answer is both. There are challenges that are universal, I think, to all federal government agency heads. One general challenge is resources, and we have a little bit of a uneven budgetary process in the United States right now, and as a result, you have to be able to manage through those types of challenges and be able to try to figure out what your budgetary priorities are. That would be to any agency leader. Here at the National Archives, we're in a really interesting, transformative moment because we are moving from a paper-based or analog archive into an era, not right now, not today, but in the very near future, in which we will be a predominantly digital archive for the United States. And we need to use this time period to be able to create the infrastructure for the National Archives to execute that transformation.
Yes, this born digital future is both, I think, a great challenge, something that is really exciting, but also daunting. And I can only imagine how daunting it is for someone in your position where the size of the data and the different types of data and all the various restrictions that may be on it and may have a period of time. How are you trying to navigate that?
What we're doing is that we are starting to plan for the future. Thankfully, because of advances in technology, the storage of electronic or born digital records probably won't be as big of a problem for us because digital storage the technology behind digital storage has moved forward and transformed itself so much in the past 5 to 10 years. But what our real specific challenge is creating the applications for which our users will then be able to access those billions and billions of digital records that will come our way. And we haven't built that structure yet, but we're going to need to build it.
And I'm going to ask you the question that probably everybody else has asked you. Mm-hmm. Is AI going to help us with this?
Absolutely. In fact, we are already using artificial intelligence in test cases, and we will start using it more aggressively, hopefully to help us with things like Freedom of Information Act requests, also for constructing useful metadata and more accurate metadata for those digital records.
So for the political scientist or the historian of the future that wants to research a presidential administration that was in the 21st century, what's their research experience going to be like?
It will probably be mostly an online experience. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be on your own. In other words, that you're just going to be able to interface with the application that we build, and there won't be any useful help for you. We are moving to have our archivists online. They will be able to consult with you, just like if you would walk into a research room today and you would consult with an archivist or a librarian. That will be available to you in an online format. In fact, that already happens today, but we are going to have to move that way to provide additional resources as the experience moves from an in-person research experience to a predominantly online one.
Yeah. So the National Archives, what do you see as their role in American society? How should Americans think about this institution?
The way that I talk about it, our mission is to preserve, protect, and share our nation's records. So that's our mission. But as far as our purpose or why we exist because in a democracy, you need records for things like accountability and legitimacy and transparency. And if you don't have those records, then you cannot have accountability, you cannot have legitimacy. And if you don't have those principles in a democracy, then your democracy really doesn't exist. So the way that I explain it as a political scientist is that the National Archives is essential for a strong democracy.
Yeah, and how do you see your own role beyond the institution itself? What is your role as this figure in American society?
Right. I mean, so my role obviously is to lead the agency on a day-to-day basis. But, in addition to that, I'm also a spokesperson for American history and the importance of understanding American history, the importance of civics education, the importance of understanding our government and how it functions. So in addition to the day-to-day operations of making sure the National Archives operates efficiently and effectively, I also try to be out in the public as much as possible, to go out to, large city public libraries, to go out into university settings and talk about the mission of the National Archives and why I think it's important that all kids learn American history and learn the basics of American government.
Now, how many National Archive locations are there around the country?
There's actually 42 different facilities across the United States. Some of those facilities are co-located with each other, but it's all across the United States. People think that we're just in Washington, D.C., where, of course, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are located. That's our headquarters. That's our historic building. But we have locations all across the United States, both archival operations and presidential libraries.
And when were the National Archives actually founded?
In the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, and he was also the one that helped to construct this building, and the building was completed under his tenure.
So before that period, what happened to all the government documents?
Unfortunately, what happened was, this is the reason why Roosevelt was really concerned, because each of the agencies and departments were in charge of their records and their papers. And he had caught wind of the fact that a lot of these records were degrading rapidly. They weren't being attended to. They were stuck in attics and basements and obviously being subject to less than ideal conditions. And so Roosevelt figured out that this was something that hadn't been created in the United States thus far. There was the Library of Congress, But the Library of Congress is different because they do not collect government records. And he realized very quickly that this institution was needed in the United States.
Now, you mentioned the presidential library system, which was also Roosevelt, and I believe that Hoover's was the first one. Can you talk a little bit more about the presidential library system and NARA's role in those, but also how they function? They're not just a government institution; they actually have partnerships as well.
That's correct. So we have 15 presidential libraries across the United States, and you're correct. Franklin Roosevelt created the presidential library system, but then Hoover wanted in on it. So he very graciously, they included President Hoover as well. And they are National Archives facilities and locations. So presidential records are one of two types of records that we have here at the National Archives. We have federal records, which are agency records, like from the Department of State or the Department of Defense or the Department of Commerce. But then we also have presidential records, which are housed at our presidential libraries. And there are terrific repositories for understanding a particular presidency, understanding that era of American history, and also, once again, a really important place for kids to go to learn something about the history of the presidency and how the presidency operates within a constitutional system. And you're right, we operate these in conjunction with presidential foundations at all of those locations, and we wouldn't be able to do all of the outreach and programming and exhibitions without the support of presidential foundations.
Now, you are in charge of this remarkable institution, and I'd love to hear more about your path to this place, because it may be, looking at your biography, it might not be what you set out to do when you graduated college or became a university professor. So I'd love to go back in time a little bit. Let's go to 1997 when you graduated college. When you were, fresh out of undergraduate, what did you want to do?
Well, I was lucky in that when I was an undergraduate, pretty early on, I discovered that I loved studying political science. I loved studying political theory, political philosophy, history of American political thought, the intersection of American history and politics. And I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD in political science. And so after undergraduate, I went directly into graduate school. I went to Yale University, and I was really lucky to be able to study with a prominent political scientist named Stephen Skowronek, who has written one of the most influential books on the American presidency. And I went to Yale with the idea that I would be in academia for most likely the remainder of my career, my entire career. And all of my energy and all of my work was really geared towards that. After finishing up my PhD, I was lucky enough that I got a tenure-track job at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., right in my area, right in my wheelhouse, teaching American politics, the presidency, women in politics, and I really had a terrific experience at George Mason. And once again, I thought that most likely this was such a great job that I would most likely stay at George Mason for the rest of my career. After about 4 years, I realized the one thing that was a deficiency in my career was that I had went right from undergraduate to graduate school, and I had never taken time really to work in government. I had never taken even time to intern in any substantial way in government. And a lot of the students that I had at George Mason, being right outside of Washington, D.C., they had worked in government or they had interned at the White House or on Capitol Hill. And as a result, I decided to apply for a fellowship with the American Political Science Association to go to work on Capitol Hill for a year. And I got the fellowship, and I went to work in Congress, and once again with the idea that I would be there for a year, come back, and then, really stand for tenure because I had satisfied all the requirements for tenure on the research side. So I was in good shape. When I got to Capitol Hill, that was really a transformative moment in my career. And some people just have these moments where I really enjoyed being an academic. I liked research and I liked writing and I liked teaching. I liked students, both graduate students and undergraduate students. But when I got to Capitol Hill, I kind of think I knew within the first couple months that this was where I was supposed to be. I really enjoyed it. I liked working in an office. I liked working as part of a team. I liked the fact that I could write memos and, after, one or two people reviewed them, that they were in the hands of my boss, who was, a pretty powerful United States senator. And I had a feeling of efficacy, I think, with my life that I had never really felt before. And what happened was that at the end of the year, my boss really liked me and offered me a job to stay on his staff in the Senate. And I had to make a decision about whether I was going to go back and return to George Mason or if I was going to stay in the Senate. And I decided that I was going to stay in the Senate. And a lot of people thought I was really crazy at the time because I walked away from a job that was a tenure track job. Like I said, I was pretty confident that I was going to get tenure. So that's a guaranteed position for life, into something as precarious as working in the United States Senate, where, day to day your job's not necessarily guaranteed and certainly not election to election. But I think it was absolutely the best decision that I could have made, because it really catapulted me then onto my career. I went to work at the Library of Congress, at the Congressional Research Service, then in the senior management at the Library of Congress for many years, then on to the White House Historical Association as the senior vice president there, and then on to the National Archives.
That's fascinating. And I want to ask you about various parts of it. So your research, what was it on?
When I was at George Mason, I wrote a lot on presidential leadership. Presidential rhetoric was really my sub area of specialty. So I wrote a book on presidential rhetoric and wrote a lot of other research articles on presidential rhetoric. I also had an interest in women in politics, so I had published a few articles in that area as well.
So do you find that your research helped you when you entered this different field, particularly now that you're in a position of leadership where a lot of people are listening to your rhetoric?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm very attuned to any speech that I give or anything that I do publicly, and I have to, in this position now, take drafts of speeches, because I don't have the time to sit down and write everything that I'm going to speak. But I do edit almost everything that I speak so that it's in my own voice, and I understand the basics of communication and rhetoric in that way. But in general, yes, I mean, being a researcher helps you immensely, I think, in Washington, D.C., because you understand how to read carefully, write carefully. At times, my background in statistics and quantitative analysis were really helpful at different moments when I was analyzing different policy proposals. So I could have never gotten to where I am today without my PhD in political science. I'm so happy that that's how I started my career.
Yeah, what lessons did you learn about presidential rhetoric in your own study? What was effective, or what are some of the errors that people have made in the past?
The biggest thing that I wrote about was that presidents have to choose their words carefully to meet the political strategy of the time. And when you found presidents who wanted to simply articulate their rhetoric in a way that was more emotionally based or something that they truly believed, rather than meeting the political strategies at the time, at the moments, the exigencies of the time, that's actually a lot of times when rhetoric falls flat. So it was an American political development type of thesis. So looking at the large circumstances surrounding choices when it comes to speech.
And now, as a teacher, were there any lessons in the classroom that you've found you've applied to managing people, or even just being a spokesperson for the National Archives?
Well, I think it's important when you're in the classroom, it's important to be I watch people's body language a lot, so you can kind of watch your students to figure out if they're listening or if they're not listening, or what the reaction is to a particular lecture, whether it resonated or it didn't. And the other thing that's really important as a leader is also to listen. I mean, it's important to listen to your students, because they will tell you, or they will articulate when they don't understand something, or when you haven't explained a concept fully. But you can only change that and improve that if you actually listen to them. And the same thing as a leader, you can't always be talking all the time. You also have to open your ears and listen to the people that report to you, or the people who work in your organization, what they're saying.
And now, as a National Archivist, you have had to go through a confirmation process and a whole bunch of other things as a political appointment, which is probably different from your previous experiences. Was there anything you learned through that process?
Well, perseverance is important. The confirmation process, the appointment, nomination, and confirmation process is very difficult these days in Congress, and it's not unique to me. So, perseverance and seeing it through is very, very important. And also just, I think, the belief that you can actually do this job, and that you are, in fact, the best person to do this job. Because if you don't believe that you're in yourself, then that's going to translate in all kinds of things whenever you're talking to senators privately before your nomination hearing, during the nomination hearing itself. You truly have to believe that, and you have to put the hard work in for preparation to get you through the process as well.
Yeah, it has to be kind of surreal as somebody who has studied politics, has probably observed confirmation hearings, and you have a perspective as an outsider and understanding what's happening and then going through it yourself.
Absolutely, and I understood every step of the way what was happening to me mostly because I had sat on the other side of the dais, and I had worked many confirmation hearings for my boss in several different committees. So it sat through it a lot. So I knew the rhythm of it. I actually could anticipate what the questions were going to be. It's still difficult when it's actually happening to you, but it does help you process it. And it also helped me. I think some people that go through the process, they personalize it so much. And so the one side of your brain, you're a human, so you definitely have emotions about that. When someone says something about you that you know isn't true, or you're being attacked. But then on the rational side of my brain, it was also going through. I was sitting there saying, oh, this is why he's doing this. Because I understand, have a better understanding about the macro political situation and what's actually happening.
Yeah, no, it's a great testament to why studying the past can be really useful to everybody today, and that the humanities still matter.
Experience leadership like never before at the George Washington Leadership Institute. Inspired by the timeless lessons of George Washington, our programs focus on critical skills like effective communication, emotional intelligence, adaptability, strategic vision, and character-driven leadership. Immerse your team in a journey through history while equipping them with strategies to navigate today's complex challenges. Join us at the beautiful George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon for half-day or full-day sessions, or customize a program to fit your needs. Visit gwleadershipinstitute.org to learn more.
So you're relatively new in your new role. Have you learned anything unexpected or something that surprised you about either the position or the archives themselves?
I think the sheer volume of the amount of records that we have here, you can read this as much as you want, but 13.5 billion pages of paper records that we have here. And you might just be able to, you read that and you say, oh, wow, that's a lot. I mean, we don't have the capacity in our own brains to understand what that is, when you start getting into the billions numbers, and until you actually see it, right? So this is what a lot of my travels have been, to go around to our various presidential libraries and archival sites, and to be able to understand what our archivists and archivist technicians are doing in order to help process and make those records available to as many Americans as possible. And that sheer volume is intimidating at times, because I've worked at the Library of Congress for over a decade, and I toured all of our storage facilities at the Library of Congress, which are vast. Most of them exist in Maryland, but they are nothing compared to what I've seen at the National Archives, just because of the sheer volume of the number of records that we have here.
Yeah, and you also have a large staff. I mean, how many people dispersed around the country? And as the leader, how do you connect with such a dispersed organization?
So it's 2,600 people that are all across the United States, and obviously I can't bring them all together in Washington, D.C. at any one period of time. That's just not feasible. So we do a lot of our meetings online. We do very regularly. We do all staff communications and all staff town meetings where I'm able to speak, and we have various speakers talking about different initiatives and programs that are going on or decisions that have been made. And then I really think that there's no replication for actually going out to those sites. And when I go out to a site, I don't just tour the site and meet people along the way. I do an hour and a half a town hall meeting with all the staff that work at that particular facility and site. And I only speak for about 5 or 10 minutes. They've heard me, on enough. I want to hear from them. I want to hear their comments and answer their questions. And many times we'll go, even over, an hour. We'll go into 90 minutes, approaching 2 hours, because staff will have so many questions for me. And it ends up being more of a dialogue back and forth. And I think out of everything that I do on any given trip, those staff meetings that I do in person are the most important of that given trip.
Yeah, and that brings up one of the questions that I have for most of the people that I've interviewed. That is, what are some of the most effective ways of being a leader when it comes to staff? And I'm hearing a lot about connection and communication, but we have folks that are going to be listening to this that are either in a management position or aspire to be in a management position. So I don't know if you have some kind of bullet points on things that you think are the most effective ways to motivate, as you mentioned in your first answer, motivate staff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to be very clear with staff. So where you get into trouble when you're a manager or supervisor is if you are not clear. Even if your body language says one thing and your words are saying another thing. I try to be very plain spoken and very direct with even people that report to me today, as well as when I started out being a manager or supervisor many years ago at the Library of Congress. And I think that even if you are setting high expectations or you're delivering a message that people initially aren't that excited to hear or aren't that wild about, the clearer and the more direct you are in those communications, the better off you will be. I think sometimes managers and supervisors, especially when they're starting out, they are understandably nervous about delivering, you might say, bad news, difficult news, things that people don't necessarily want to hear for one reason or the other. And so they sugarcoat it a little bit, or they might be a little bit soft in how they're delivering the message. That is always going to end up being more problematic for you in the long run than in the short run. Same thing. This is a great lesson that applies to classroom experience as well. The more direct you are with the students you are teaching, the more forthright and honest you are with them about expectations, grading, or assignments, the better off you're going to be throughout the semester. And it's really the same thing to staff that you supervise or that you manage.
Actually reminds me of a little anecdote of my own career, which is that I taught at Williams, and they had this evaluation for effective teaching, and there was these two numbers at the bottom that were the only ones that really matter, but you're graded on 27 different, and they were able to connect what was the most likely thing to have a high score at the bottom, a good score at the bottom, to one of those other 20-odd rubrics in which you were evaluated by the students. And ease of grading was one of them, but that wasn't it. It was actually clarity. And that was something, too, that I learned, that, clarity is so important. And you talked about delivering bad messages. What's the worst one you've had to deliver?
Oh, I mean, gosh, the worst one that I've had to deliver. Well, I mean, when I lived through sequestration at the Library of Congress, budgetary sequestration. And we, unfortunately at that time had to deliver news that everybody was taking furlough days because the Library of Congress had to give everyone, I think it was 3 furlough days in order to meet budget because of the influence of sequestration. That was not a good news to have to deliver because nobody wants to take 3 days without pay that they weren't necessarily planning for. I mean, in other instances, I've had to terminate people, which is really not the most pleasant thing that you can do, or explain that, the Inspector General has investigated you and has found that you've been doing these things that you really shouldn't be doing. Those are always awkward conversations. But once again, delivering it, practicing it in that case, which is, a little bit uncomfortable for everyone, even practicing it once or twice in the mirror or with someone else before you go in and sit down with a person, that's very, very helpful. And if you do that, then you'll find that you'll be better prepared for the discussion.
Yeah. So no one's perfect. Any mistakes that you've made that have also proved very useful for you?
Sure. I think that in my career, certainly when I was starting out in management and supervision, and especially even whenever I started to manage and supervise larger groups of people, so not just a small team of 10 or 12, but, 70, 80 people, and then up from there, I was always a really hard worker, but I was also probably reactive to a lot of things. So something would come up to me about a problem that we had, and my immediate reaction would be to solve that problem really, really quickly. And so that's more of a reactive leadership posture. And I think as I became more comfortable as a leader and learned more. I was exposed to some good leaders. I learned that I didn't have to be so quick to pull the trigger, that I could be more in most situations. I mean, obviously, if it's the life, health, or safety of someone, you have to be very quick. But that's usually not what's happening in day-to-day management, things like the federal government. In what I was doing, it's actually is much, much better to take a moment and evaluate the situation, even if it makes you upset or you have an emotional response to it. Get those emotions under control and think about it, and then come up with a plan for action. And when I started actually deliberatively being slower in how I reacted to situations, I found that my leadership got better.
That's great. Mm-hmm. So now I want to ask you a few questions about influences on your own career. And as somebody who's studied the past and presidents and political leaders, are there figures that loom large for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say this, and I'm not just trying to cozy up to you, but I mean, George Washington's been a huge influence in my life. I wrote my undergraduate senior thesis in political science on George Washington and his influences on the establishment of the presidency. And Washington's leadership has always inspired me because Washington, I mean, this is where a lot of this comes into play that I just spoke about. You know, Washington was very quick to anger naturally. He was an energetic guy, and he had to really work hard to figure out how to get some of that spiritedness under control. And I think over time, Washington certainly became more of a reflective leader, which greatly influential. I don't think that we would have our constitutional democracy today that we have unless save George Washington, because imagine the influence, imagine the pressure on him after winning the Revolutionary War, which nobody really necessarily expected to happen. And everywhere all around you, there's kings, and monarchies and autocracy. And that is the accepted mode of government. And Washington certainly could have become a benevolent king, and there were people that wanted him to become a benevolent king. And he rejected all of that and retires back to Mount Vernon for a period of time before he becomes president. And I just think that goes against the entire grain of what he would have known about in Western culture and Western history. Yet he decided to chart his own path, which is just extraordinary.
Yeah, and as somebody that was a researcher, probably still has a toe in that water. How have you, I mean, having gotten a PhD, gone straight from undergraduate, have you left that part of your life behind, or do you still stay, attuned to what's happening in your field? Or
I try to. So I am going to go to a presidency conference in April. I'm going to actually be in the conference. I'm going to do a lunchtime chat, but I'm going to get to attend the entire day. And I'm going to listen to a bunch of colleagues and scholars that I know talk about the presidency and executive politics for the day, which I think is going to be extraordinarily important. At the White House Historical Association, I spent a lot of time writing. So that was my most recent position. So I was able to do a lot of that for the better part of 3 years. And that was terrific. And there are times here that I'm able to engage in that type of work. I get invited to write short essays for publications at certain points in time. And I just have to be careful about my workload before I accept those things. But if I'm careful, then I can carve out the time in which to be able to write those things and really enjoy it.
Has your view of the presidency changed at all, having now first been on the Capitol Hill and then now with the White House Historical Association, now really at a senior level in the government?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, when I first started out as a scholar, I had a very presidency-centric view of our government. I guess that makes sense because that's what I studied and that's what my dissertation was on, and that was the course that I was teaching. But, for many, many years, I was on Capitol Hill, not working in the Senate, but then I worked at the Library of Congress for well over a decade. So I think it was about 14 years spent working on Capitol Hill. And that was really important because it taught me about the importance of the legislative branch, that Congress is the first branch of government. And so now I have a much more balanced view about the tension between those two institutions, the separation of powers, and how that all works out. So I don't think I had that before I worked on Capitol Hill. So I think that was really important.
Yes. One of my last questions, I of course love Washington being one of your, an influence, but were there other people that influenced you that perhaps we don't know, names we don't know, but nonetheless were really influential in your own development?
Sure. I mean, I had a really great boss in the Senate, the legislative director. His name was Joe Goffman, and he was really influential to me once again about how to be a thoughtful leader in that type of environment, in a really high pressure environment. But that doesn't mean that you have to not think things through and be deliberative. I had a really good boss also in the Senate. His name was Fred Downey, and he was a former Army colonel. And he did the defense portfolio in the office where I worked. And he taught me a lot about how the Senate operates. And also he was very big about, you don't always have to work, slow yourself down. Don't be so eager. You don't have to do everything in the first hour of the day. We've got 8 hours, 9 hours here in a day. He was a terrific supervisor and a great role model for me. I've been lucky. I've interacted with some really fantastic people. Carla Hayden, who was the Librarian of Congress, I was able to see how she single-handedly transformed that institution. Now, it took her a few years to be able to do that, but she brought her own vision to that institution, and her predecessor, who I also knew, James Billington, had been there for a very long time. And so the institution was on a particular path. And Dr. Hayden had a view that was adjacent to that view, but had her own preferences as a public librarian coming to play. And she also persevered. She really stuck with it. And it takes a while to be able to shape an institution. And she was never daunted by that, which is very inspiring. And then the woman that I worked alongside at the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, I was the vice chair of the commission, but the chair of the commission was a woman named Susan Combs, who was a presidential appointee under President Trump. She was the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Budget. And before that, Susan had been the comptroller in the state of Texas. And I was just so honored to work alongside Susan because she kept the commission. We took a very bipartisan view of everything that we did. She included me in all the decisions. She didn't have to as the chair, but she included me in every decision as the vice chair. And she brought such an energy, enthusiasm to the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I really think fondly of my time working with Susan. So all of those people have been very influential in my life, plus many others.
Yeah, and that's a great way to segue to kind of the last questions I want to ask you, which is about the future of the National Archives. Mm-hmm. And you saw Carla Hayden, a new Librarian of Congress, take over that institution. So when you think about the future of the National Archives, what do you want to see as your legacy?
Sure. We're on a good path and track to becoming a more user-centered institution. I was a user of the National Archives as a researcher, and that's the background and experience that I bring to the position. So I want to be able to transform both our in-person experiences at museums that we have across the United States and our presidential libraries, our museum here in Washington, D.C., our in-person researcher experience, as well as our online digital researcher experience, our catalog, for example. So we're going to be approaching a lot of our challenges and problems from the viewpoint of our users and our visitors, and figuring out how we can make sure that we provide the best possible interaction and experiences with American history as we can.
Yeah, and what are some of the challenges you see from getting from A to B?
Like I said before, resources is certainly a challenge, so you can't do everything all at once. And so you have to make choices and strategic decisions. So you might say, I want to do these 10 initiatives this year, which would help me get from A to B, but I only have money to really do 3. So you have to make very, very hard decisions, and you have to have a good senior leadership team that can engage in those discussions, and so we can make the educated decisions that will further our strategic priorities as much as we can with the resources that we have. And then also some of it, what we're starting to solve this, is getting the information and data from our users to find out exactly what we should be doing. And that hasn't been something that has previously been done in the past at the National Archives, but we are doing that now, surveying users of our online catalog about their online experiences, and then also going directly to our researchers that come into our research rooms all across the country, surveying them, finding out what works and what needs to be improved.
One of the challenges that I've heard about existing in other libraries and in archives is going back to what you talked about earlier, the digital future. And at the same time, staff expertise and knowledge and trying to get the staff aligned with the digital future and their own skill set. So for a 2,600 person operation, I mean, what are some of the ways that you're going to address that challenge?
Well, we can do that partially through training, but we also have to be realistic about it and understand that we need to, and this comes again to the priorities, we need to set aside funding so that we can also bring on board the expertise that we don't have right now. And there are people being trained right now to be digital librarians and to be digital in library schools and information schools all across the country. And they bring that particular skill set to the table. And we are going to have to make hard choices to be able to find the funding so that we can start to build that new repository of staff expertise for the future.
Yeah, and my last question is, for anybody listening out there, what is the one thing you want them to know about the National Archives?
Oh, that we're open for business, and they should come and visit us if you can in person, and if you can't, to visit our website and to engage with us as much as you can online, because these are your records. We hold them in trust for you at the National Archives, but the records of the United States belong to the citizens, and we are here to provide you with the access to those materials.
Yeah, and on a personal level, I just can't tell you how transformative Founders Online.
Yep.
So that for those listening, George Washington's papers, but also all the other founders, the National Archives host a remarkable resource that has all of those transcribed, keyword searchable. They're interlinked with each other. It is just it is a national treasure in a digital format.
It is. As a researcher, anytime where I've heard of a letter or heard of this, and you can go in Founders Online and you can immediately find it. It's a great resource.
Great. Well, thank you, Colleen.
Thank you.
Communication is a cornerstone of effective leadership, and as Colleen Shogan illustrated today, clear and impactful communication is essential for guiding institutions through change. In our rapidly evolving technological landscape, it is crucial for leaders to adaptably manage and communicate transformations within their organizations. We're grateful for the opportunity to delve into Colleen's approach to visionary leadership, digital transformation, and the vital role of effective communication. Her insights into leading the National Archives, embracing new technologies, and improving user experiences reveal the complexities and demands of guiding a major institution. Next time, what does it mean to lead in a democracy? And what exactly is the civic bargain? Historian and consultant Brooke Manville shares lessons learned from a life in leadership.
And the idea is that we're trying to define democracy in a very simple to understand way. Because there's millions of often very nuanced discussions of what democracy is. We said it's basically people living and working together with no boss except one another.
Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library is a production of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Patrick Spiro and Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Our executive producers are Dr. Ann Fertig and Heather Subra. We would like to thank today's guest, Colleen Shogan. To learn more about Washington's leadership example, or to find out how you can bring your team to the George Washington Presidential Library, go to www.gwleadershipinstitute.org. Or, to find more great podcasts from Mount Vernon, go to www.georgewashingtonpodcast.com.